We have the honor to have two women who have been allies of the psychoactive plants, especially for the defense. I'll introduce firstly to Julie Hanna. So she's a director of the International Center on Human Rights and Drug Policy, where she has been leading high-impact research and teaching projects since 2012. Her work has been internationally recognized in the areas of human rights and drug control. Julie's current research focuses on human rights institutions and drug policy, migration and harm reduction, the intersection of the right to mental health and drug policy, and the human rights impact of a post-drug prohibition world. She's a member of the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex, where she's also an advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, supporting the mandate's thematic research on mental health and engagement with civil society. She has also spent more than 10 years leading humanitarian and human rights projects for marginalized communities, particularly those in Southeast Asia. And Pin, who is also an ally of ICEERS, and especially for the ADF legal cases, the platform for ICEERS for the defense of legal plants or the people who are in conflict with the law for the use of plants. So thank you very much, Pin, for being here. She's a researcher with the Transnational Institute. She holds a Master of Arts degree in Political Science and International Relations from University of Amsterdam. She has been a member of the Transnational Institute's Drug and Democracy team since 2002 through her participation with the program dates further back. She lived in Latin America for several years, spending most of that time in the Andean region. During those years, she dedicated most of her time and energy to research, development, and implementation of drug policy, particularly in relation to coca and cocaine. She worked with local and international experts and NGOs. She has written numerous articles and contributed to various books and publications on the drug policy in Latin America in 1996. So I just want to make sure for the persons who are doing the translations that Pin will be speaking in Spanish. We're balancing this panel. So I would like to give the floor to Julie, who will introduce, to Pin, I'm sorry, that will introduce the object of this panel, that is to explore the disconnect between two bodies of laws and policies, which are the human rights that are constantly in conflict with those of drug control. So Pin, you could do it there. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm a little bit tired. Don't want to stand up. No hay mucha gente en la sala. Muy buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por su presencia.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presence. Not so many people in the room. My presentation will be focused on the work we are doing at the TNI for some years now. And one of the topics we deal with is traditional use of plants and the rights of users and producers of prohibited plants. There is indeed an undeniable disconnect between the obligations created by the drug control system and the rights of the indigenous people. With the approval of the Single Convention in 1961, the signatory states were bound to make disappear the traditional use of coca, leaves, cannabis, and opium. Their uses should have disappeared in 1989, according to the desire of the international community at that point. The convention also has some transitory caveats for the traditional uses, but it says that the use of cannabis and chewing of coca in religious ceremonies and all other indigenous practices called non-medical uses have to disappear. The Convention on Psychotropics in 1971 encompasses a number of substances different from those in 1961. The regime could be considered to be not so strict, leaving some legal space, some legal margin for its use in religious ceremonies. Peyote, mushrooms, and ayahuasca are included, not included in any international list. In the list of the convention, only alkaloids contained in these plants are included, not the plants themselves, as well as mescaline, psilocybin, and dente. As for the governments of Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, they looked for an exemption so that the traditional use of coca could be accepted, and this is why there was a mention of human rights that should be respected in the 3 existing treaties on drugs in the world. In the place where there is whenever there is historical evidence, this is in Article 14.2 of the last convention. Up to this date, the right to traditional use of plants banned in treaties is still pending subject that should be sorted out by the international community. For the traditional uses of opium and cannabis, the same applies, although for marijuana things are changing now. There's 2 countries that have formally recognized in their legislation the ceremonial use: Jamaica and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and other countries in the Caribbean are considering doing the same soon, accepting this kind of use. However, the challenges in countries that want to reform their cannabis markets also as a reason for development, the challenges are huge, and it is a concern to see how this could end up being business for some foreign corporate leaders instead of the traditional producers. So at the TNI, we push for legislative reforms for the legal recognition throughout the world. There's many other human rights that are being breached by the current drug policies. One of them has to do with the right to an appropriate life level, and it is intimately intricated and linked to the producers of illicit drugs. One of the instruments is forced eradication, which is applied throughout the world against farming communities that depend on this cultivation for sustaining their lives. In most cases, the only way to sustain themselves and the only option within the reach, the physical destruction of crops, is one of the main tools to apply the international drug fiscalization system that breaches the human rights of growers and their communities to have a decent level of life and not to suffer from hunger. And I would like to mention a especially controversial method, which is aerial fumigation, fertilization, and this happens in Colombia, but also in Mexico, South Africa, and Morocco. And it is one of the methods which is more aggressive to human rights. The dusting or fumigation or dusting of these crops and spraying of these crops. And so measures should be found in order to have access to regulated cannabis markets, as is happening in many countries, and finding a way for some fair trade, fostering in the debate that those who have always supplied the black market now have the real risk of being left out now that it becomes a legal business. And that's my piece.
having a human rights dimension and approach to drug policy and the disconnect that exists between the implementation of drug control laws and agencies. So now Julie Hanna will talk about a project that she held herself, and she will use these guidelines to address this connection that seems to be coming between drug control policies and human rights.
Okay, I'd like to, I'd like to start my remarks this evening by thanking the organizers of the ASIRS conference and for inviting me to speak at this session on the disconnect between human rights and drug policy. It's a real privilege to be here amongst such distinguished scholars, many of whom were in the last panel, practitioners, activists, humans from diverse settings, all doing really impressive work. This is my first ayahuasca conference, and I've learned a great deal in the past day and a half, and I really look forward to continuing my education here in these concluding days. So Natalia's asked me to share a few comments on the work that I've been part of to help bridge this disconnect between human rights and drug policy. Pien provided some great and really powerful reflections on how the international framework of drug control, known by many as drug prohibition, has created a context for highly punitive and repressive laws, policies, and practices that impact the lives of many in our global community. All aspects of this challenge have human rights implications, and I think you heard about that in the panel earlier, but that is including when it comes to traditional plants. At the international level, the legal framework of drug control has had a powerful influence on how governments around the world develop responses to the illicit drug trade, from cultivation to consumption. And a bifurcated narrative of supply reduction and demand reduction has captured and limited the imagination of public policy when it comes to psychoactive substances, creating the context for oftentimes widespread and systemic violations of human rights. However, the international political conversation, which is really where my work comes in, has not been entirely silent on the issue of human rights and drug policy. Since the late 1990s, the United Nations General Assembly have resolutions that acknowledge that countering the world drug problem must be carried out in full conformity with all human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this has been reaffirmed in every major UN political declaration on drug control since that time. But the reality, as we know, as we've heard, as we continue to hear, is deeply disconnected from this rhetoric. One important challenge that we identified has been a lack of clarity as to what human rights law requires of governments in the context of drug control law, policy, and practice. Sustainable, just, rights-based action on drug control requires shared standards from which to begin, a shared framework for understanding how these two systems interact. Despite nearly 50 years of progressive development of international human rights standards, there's not been a comprehensive application of these standards to the issue of drug policy. It's been ad hoc here and there, and it's becoming a real challenge. So the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy are the results of a 3-year consultative process to address this gap. The process involved 7 global, I don't know what happened, and expert convenings that took place in the development of this tool. It involved a range of stakeholders. It wasn't just civil society, it was not just the United Nations, it included governments from all over the world, and ministries, and different ministries from health to justice to development, as well as indigenous communities. We all came together to shape and develop the guidelines from basically a series of blank pieces of paper that we had stuck along different walls all over a conference room. And our aim was to map the experience of international drug control and normatively ground that experience in a set of succinct, forward-looking standards to guide governments towards more progressive rights-based reforms. So the result of this process is here on the screen. There are 27 principles that capture the entire human experience of drug control. The narrative of supply and demand has been replaced with the narrative that places individuals, communities, and their empowerment at the foreground of how we understand controlled drugs and related policies, including traditional plants. The guidelines cut across 3 public policy sectors, so you'll see here development, criminal justice, health, and we also focus on the specific rights of 4 groups of real concern in this area: children, women, persons deprived of their liberty, and indigenous peoples. The guidelines highlight the measures states should undertake or should not undertake in order to comply with their human rights obligations, while taking into account their concurrent obligations under the International Drug Control Conventions, which Pien discussed and you heard earlier. Critically, they don't invent new rights. Most of us were actually quite disappointed in the final product. A lot of us thought it just wasn't progressive enough. But this is a document that must live and be implementable in the complexities of our current political and legal environment. So they apply existing human rights law to the legal and policy context of drug control in order to maximize the human rights protections, including the interpretation and implementation of drug control obligations. So I thought I'd share with you just a few highlights. You heard a little bit about religious freedoms earlier, and I think that some of them are of importance to the conversations that have been happening this weekend. The first one that I want to look at in the foundational principles is meaningful participation. Everyone has the right to participate in public life. This includes the right to meaningful participation in the design, implementation, and assessment of drug laws, policies, and practices, particularly by those directly affected. The same levels of participation they're enhanced for the indigenous communities, who have the right to free, prior, and informed consent. Indigenous peoples have that right regarding matters affecting them. This includes the right to be consulted on drug control measures and national and international agreements that may affect their lands, resources, cultures, and identities, as well as the right to give or withhold this consent. We'll go back to land. Pien talked a little bit about forced eradication, including aerial spraying, where poison is dumped on communities. It's dumped on their homes, it's dumped on their food. Both of us have visited some of those communities and seen the impacts directly. So there is in the guidelines, we talk a bit about human rights and environmental protection being interdependent. So this really important relationship between the rights of individuals and the land that provides for them. And we call for an abolition of the aerial spraying of pesticides, herbicides, and other chemicals as a method to prevent and eradicate illicit drug crops, absent proof that such chemicals pose no risk to human life or the environment. Another really important area and related to land, and you can see how interactive this website is, easy to follow, is here. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination and to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. They also have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they have traditionally owned, occupied or otherwise acquired. Indigenous peoples have the right to conserve their lands and protect them from harm caused by drug control measures. We talked a bit about religious use. That's featured here in the guidelines as well. And so I think I'll just kind of end it there. There's quite a lot around traditional use. Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs, and to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies. This includes the right to use and cultivate plants and plant-based substances that have psychoactive effects, where these are part of their cultural, spiritual, or religious practices. So for the group of civil society actors, UN agencies, academics that kind of came together and put this document, we felt that it really helped add the necessary complexity to the discussion about traditional plants. They're no longer reduced to just a substance. And I've lost my last page. I'll move over to the that happened last time.
That's the last page, yeah.
And instead, they're multifaceted and understood in terms of land, medicine, culture, tradition, and justice. So human rights are not just static norms, they're animated by the people and movements that shape our global community through activism, litigation, police reform, knowledge exchange, et cetera, et cetera. This tool is just one small contribution to the broader human rights project of just and equitable drug reform. It's for you to use as you see appropriate to nourish your future work. Thank you.
And thank you, Julie, because it is because of human rights having this dynamic kind of essence is that ayahuasca touches among a lot of human rights recognized. As you said, the guidelines were not invented. They're always based on something that has occurred in the past. So, of course, with the indigenous people, it touches among the consent, the consultations that must be done, the self-determination, the right to use the resources and lands. So hopefully this document will also illustrate and educate how states can correctly implement human rights without being in collision with obligations under international law and drug control bodies. So we would like to open the floor. If there is anyone who wants to make any question or comments, or else I'll tell Pim to continue the storytelling. So is anyone having any question? Yeah, there's someone coming.
Hi. I would like to know if these guidelines are applied to any kind of drug, or if there is a differentiation between legal permitted drugs, and why. I think that maybe because I don't know much English, but the use of the word drug to refer to medicinal plants is not problematic, or.
Yeah, so the project was really about applying the human rights standards to substances, plants, medicines that are subject to international drug control. So the substances, the plants, the medicines that fall under the international drug control treaties that Pien spoke about in her earlier comments. So the term is used, I think, interchangeably throughout the document.
But don't you think that there is some bias with the term, that it's applied to, like, to heroin, to cocaine, and also to, like, medicines like ayahuasca or coca? Don't you think that should be a differentiation between those two concepts? I don't know if the international legislation recognizes this difference between these two ideas.
Yeah, I mean, we could agree, but the thing is that the international drugs control system has made these choices about certain substances being put under control and others not. The value that we give to substances as a medicine is not reflected into this control system, and the current drug control system needed checks and balances that would take into account human rights, because all we've seen in the past decades is a tremendous amount of violations of human rights of those involved in the illicit market. So making a distinction between a medicine and a drug for the international, the international drug control system is basically designed to separate substances that have medicinal and scientific uses from those that have not. So and we argue that the reason that they've been included have been based on false evidence. Most of these plants have many medicinal values that are not recognized by the system. So, but still, the way it is functioning now requires human rights standards, because the way it's being applied is violating basic rights of all those involved in the market, being a medicine or not. It's sort of a different discussion if you understand what I mean. No. Not really.
It seems as though during this and the last conversation, one of the fundamental questions that seems to be left out is the simple question of who owns your body. You know, really that's the fundamental human right of all, is that you own your own body, and that, you know, what you put into it is your business. I mean, I hope we're understanding that when we're talking about human rights. This is more of a comment than a question. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Right to privacy and bodily autonomy are included in that set of standards.
But we do think that it goes beyond that, because, I mean, it's the way the drug control system now is working is not just affecting individual choices, it's also affecting the right of communities to develop, the right, the way people can organize themselves, or access to certain substances that is restricted by this system. So it goes beyond my individual right to choose to use something and put something in my body. So it's bigger than that, I think. Yeah.
Hello, thanks a lot for this beautiful and so much needed work. Very small question. The first is that if the website is also in Spanish? Okay. And if there are indigenous groups, for instance, in Colombia, I'm from Colombia, and all the South, the Putumayo leaders and the Cauca leaders and the Nariño leaders, they are facing a new law of glyphosate eradication again.
Yes.
And it's proven that it has been so damaging in the Sierra Nevada of Colombia, where many kids died by the hundreds just because of the fumigation, and all the crops are affected and the health. What mechanism they will have? Like, because I know the groups are organized and they have some leaders, but there are also small groups that are not, that are in the place where it's going to be fumigated and they don't have access to this information. Can they contact somebody? It's somebody that that I could, because I work with people in Putumayo, that I could help them reach, or that could support them at least in the fight.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's the Observatorio de Cultivos de Uso Ilícito y Cultivadores de Uso Ilícito que está monitoreando. They're monitoring in Colombia and the reapplication of the aerial spraying there. So there's a network of human rights defenders that is now been built in the past decade that is specifically watching what's going to happen next. And it's actually already started in Colombia, the spraying. So we are very worried, because it's one of the first steps taken in the wrong direction that will disintegrate the whole peace accord. And it's very worrying what is going on now these past few weeks in terms of leaders that have been assassinated, but particularly in the area of the crops. We feel that this has already shown that there's no commitment from the government to really change their policies on that subject. So yeah, definitely it's something that we should keep on monitoring and call out to the international community to interact, because it's a great offense to human rights. It's a great violation of human rights, the way the spraying has been going on.
And for the Observatorio, would De Justicia be a good organization for her to connect
Also,
with,
yeah.
in terms of just making sure communities are connected with the information that they need to move, to know when the spraying happens, etc. So maybe we can give you some contact names at the end.
Yeah, because I work with some people that are not in the front of the fight, let's say it. So because there is a big group organized and indigenous leaders that they know, but there are many families on the edge that they don't have that access to the information, and they could.
Sí, te podemos proporcionar algún nombre, teléfono y todo para.
Sure, I can give you names and phone numbers, of course. Thank you. Hello. I wanted to ask how we can open up centers, retreat centers in Spain for the consumption of ayahuasca. How could that be done? in a legal way to avoid having problems? Because I know that it's not legal, but it's not illegal. And there are many ayahuasca consumption centers in Barcelona, in Spain. How do they do it to avoid legal issues? I think that's more of a question for ICers, because they're in fact now starting a legal battle about organizing consumers and creating a consumers club to achieve legal protection against the state. So perhaps Natasha could help you there. Natalia. Yeah, well, it's quite a complicated question. As you say, we are in a gray area. It's not legal, but it's not illegal. What we are trying to say at ICERS is we're trying to establish good practices, best practices. Jerónimo is also here. He's been working hard on that here. The issue of self-regulation so that communities can have practices at the highest level of standards in terms of health, safety, integration. So we have to see how we can legally then import ayahuasca, if that can be done legally. That's, there are sort of random searches, and they tell us that then they'll go after ayahuasca at the minutest molecules. So we need to see whether there is any kind of mechanism to guarantee that this illegality can transit towards a more regulated framework. But anyway, I hope that I'm trying to answer your question. It's a bit random as well, how centers can operate in the legal scenario. Thank you. I'd like to talk to you later, if I may. And I'd also like to say that we're trying to create consumption groups for coca in Europe to push on the legal space. There are quite a lot of coca users, and in some cases they are people who come from Andean countries, countries of origin, but there are other cases like myself or many others who transcended that reality. We're not from the Andes and we do not have that ancestral habit, but we have become coca users, and we want to have the right to use coca without being criminalized. So in order to create that space, we need to become organized, and we need to try and find spaces to stand up for our right. So this is not going to happen easily. I mean, you are committing a crime according to the law, but also through court cases we could establish precedent, and then with our arguments we could try to expand things, because it's thoroughly unfair. Coca is a gift of the gods to mankind. It's a shame that we're not allowed to use it worldwide. So yeah, that's another front we have open. Are there any other questions? Yes, we have a couple.
So this document comes from established rights, and there's all kinds of ways that there's these human rights violations that have more to do with the human rights violations of how the drugs are being prohibited. You know, there's, aside from just the right to use a particular drug, if the government is acting in ways to prohibit drug use that violate human rights, that then would be a basis of a human rights suit, I'm assuming. So that's my question. Is there an attempt to use this document, because it's, I understand, trying to articulate existing human rights already, and this is in cooperation with the United Nations. So then governments that are acting in violation of those rights would be guilty of crimes? technically. I understand I'm a lawyer. I understand the reality of what we hold a government to. But in the U.S. system, you can sue for an ongoing violation of your rights by the government. Is this what is contemplated through the formation of this document? Is that something that's in motion? Is there a particular country or community in which it seems to be the best positioned to have perhaps the best go at it, that the UN may be more or less willing to listen to this issue?
So the international treaties themselves don't establish any sort of really hard enforcement mechanism.
Right.
So there's no sort of human rights crimes tribunal. And even sort of the war crimes tribunals that exist are very dysfunctional at the moment. So it really is sort of how you translate these standards, how they've been incorporated into national laws themselves, how a lot of constitutions themselves have embodied and embraced human rights standards and principles, much like in the U.S. with the Bill of Rights and the cases of the case that Jeffrey spoke about earlier. So it's really just a means to nourish and fortify national level fights and challenges to both the constitutionality and the legality of various different measures. So there isn't some big international court, and I think that's a good thing, personally, but it is really just a way to sort of take the pressure of sort of the international norms that have evolved and exist and apply that pressure in national jurisdictions and even local. Even it doesn't have to be a sort of a federal level engagement. We have been working on developing an implementation strategy with various different governments themselves because they're important actors in the implementation process. It doesn't have to be adversarial. These can be constructive ways of helping very, very good, well-meaning, intended public servants who want to figure out a way to strengthen or transform policies. So there's sort of a constructive level of engagement that's being planned. I know that there are some advocates and litigators who I've spoken with in various different countries who are preparing their cases already, and not because of the guidelines, but the guidelines can help nourish their arguments. They can help strengthen some of the lines of argumentation. So it's really just sort of another additional layer of oomph. If that helps, I don't know.
Is there a country or a region that you find to be more welcoming, or that is actually seems like a place where that engagement could have some traction?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The process of developing this was also a process of developing ownership in the document itself and sort of the principles that it embodies. And governments from all parts of the world were engaged with various levels of extreme repressive policies versus more progressive ones. So there's kind of a wide collection of potential partners in the implementation process. I will say that the governments of Germany and Switzerland were funders of the initiative as well, and I know that it's part of sort of ongoing work in their foreign policy. What that means at the domestic level, I don't know.
Y la última, rápido, que nos queda un minuto y medio.
Sí, bueno, aprovecho.
Yes, thank you. And since we have translators, I'm going to speak Spanish if I may. First of all, I'd like to thank you because your documents are of great help for us activists to change drug policies or to at least attempt to do so. My question is, these guidelines, are you in negotiations with UNODC? Are you trying to create a protocol for countries for the implementation of drug policies respecting human rights? Sorry, could you repeat that? You asked whether there is a protocol? Yeah. My question is, are you working through your organization on a protocol with UNODC for the implementation of drug policies, bearing in mind human rights as well in United Nations member states? No, we're not working on protocols, but we are definitely trying to take the human rights discourse to them. We're trying to gain recognition for certain rights, for certain anomalies or excesses which have existed in the field of the implementation of drug policies. I'll give you an example. The issue of forced eradication, of forced eviction, which for us has always been very important because we believe it is completely counterproductive, it's inefficient, it violates human rights. And we have seen how UNODC has changed its discourse, and it has become more moderate compared to other governments who are after more punitive, harsher measures. So, UNODC implements. We are working with the narcotics divisions, and we're working with governments who are willing to change their policies, and we help them see how they can work with the international regime, which is not easy, as you know, because most countries in the world are prohibitionist, unfortunately. Well, but luckily we're going to have these guidelines which will provide harmonization between these two systems, which appear to be so in conflict. So, Pin, thank you for your words, for your questions, and Julie, thank you for your answers and solutions. I think we now have a coffee break. Thank you.